Welcome everybody to our webinar. Simon, if we could have the first slide, please.
There we go.
So today we're going to be talking about how to effectively manage your data assets. This is DPN in partnership with ProvePrivacy. I'm Robert Bond and I'm going to be chairing or moderating this session. I wanted to introduce the panel to you, but first a little bit about our sponsor. ProvePrivacy or ProvePrivacy is everything your organization needs to demonstrate data protection compliance in a single integrated program. Their platform simplifies compliance and provides an efficient and collaborative solution for information governance professionals to manage data within the organization. Your information asset register will be linked to your ROPA, and by the way, we're going to be spending some time looking at the relationship between the register and ROPA. And when done properly, it'll allow you to understand the risks associated with each asset whilst it's in use and whilst the data is in retention. So on your behalf, thank you to ProvePrivacy. I'm now going to ask Louise Garrett-Cox if she could say a few words about herself, please.
Hi everybody, I'm Data Protection Manager at Parkdean Results. I've been here for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I've worked in a range of roles across compliance and data protection for over a decade.
Thank you. And from ProvePrivacy, Mark, can you say a few words, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Mark Roebuck. I founded ProvePrivacy way back in 2018, and that came out of my work as a data protection consultant, which I've been doing for quite a while now. I work for a number of organizations across medtech and many other places, and so I kind of work from experience with ProvePrivacy.
Super. And Simon, over to you.
Hi everyone. Hi. Yeah, I'm Simon Blanchard. I'm a partner at DPN, or DPN Associates as we're known. So many of you may already know us, but for those who don't, we provide kind of training solutions. We provide consultancy to businesses of all different organizations, really of all shapes and sizes, in UK and overseas as well. So Robert, shall I pick up the first part that we've got here about information assets? So just to kind of set the scene for everyone today, if that's okay. So obviously we're going to be talking about information assets and looking at kind of how we effectively overlay data protection over the top of understanding. So just give you a little bit of information really around, so what do we mean by this term information assets or data assets? So information assets are really a record of the information that your organization is storing. So it can be the electronic or physical form, of course, old-fashioned kind of physical forms in filing cabinets, but it can be things like the information and records that you would hold on your HR system or your CRM system, things like your email accounts, your cloud storage or your backups, any of those things. So to give you an example, let's just pick something as an example that we can all relate to. If we look at kind of employment, for example, we've got first the recruitment stage. So in recruiting individuals, you will have records associated with that, such as CVs, letter of appointment, all the checks that you might do. So all of those will be classed as an information asset. You'd have employment files such as contracts of employment, appraisals, pay reviews, all of those kind of things. So these are the kind of things that we're talking about when we say information assets. But of course, these might come in different shapes and sizes, and of course, there are varying value to the organization and varying levels of sensitivity and confidentiality. So looking at the two main categorizations we've got here, we've of course got personal data or personal information. But in addition to that, and those of course are the ones that we're going to really focus on today, it's going to be personal data, obviously special category data, more sensitive within that. But we'll also be across information assets. It's more broad than personal data. So we're also considering things like corporate records, intellectual property, and other kinds of corporate information, some of which will be very sensitive, in fact, but lots of it may have no sensitive at all, or very limited sensitivity. But all of that is included kind of within this broad understanding of information assets. So you've heard this term information asset register. What do we mean by that? So effectively, it's an inventory of all of that personal and non-personal information that we have, including things that would be useful indicators to us, particularly as data protection professionals, privacy professionals, things that would indicate the value or the sensitivity or the risk of that data. So things like how we classify it, like I've said, personal data or corporate information, etc. Which system it's on and which location it's on, whether it's electronic or digital form, how those assets are secured, who's accountable for them, who's the asset owner, all of those kind of things. So I'll pass over to you now then, Robert.
That's great. Thank you, Simon. Just a bit of admin before we move on. If you've got any questions or comments, please use the chat box, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. I'll try and take questions as they come in. We've already had a load of questions in advance of the webinar, which I'll be turning to in a minute. But before we get into the questions, we're going to use a couple of polls during the course of this afternoon. So I wondered if we could have the first poll, please, Simon. You're on mute, Simon.
Apologies, sorry. I was doing that deliberately because I can hear a little bit of noise on the line. So I don't know if anyone else can hear it. If we could go on to mute talking, that might help. I just got the poll up.
And I can see that everybody's kindly responding to the poll now. And there we are. Does your organization currently have an information asset register? Yes, updated regularly, 19% of you. Yes, but it's a work in progress, and I would rather expect that at 63%. And then 10% not yet, and 6% no. Hopefully, after the course of the next 50 minutes, those percentages might change one way or another. Okay, thank you for the polls, Simon. What I wanted to do now is I'm going to turn to Mark first. We're talking about asset registers. Mark, what actually are data assets?
So, as Simon mentioned earlier, they're the places in your organization, or they're artifacts within your organization which contain personal data, or as Simon says, non-personal data as well. From a data protection perspective, we're interested in data, in assets, because we want to make sure they're protected. So we need to look at the types of assets we have, which is paper forms. There's assets such as data held on applications, the applications themselves. Data which is held with third parties is something which quite often gets missed off a register. So, for example, when data goes into retention, especially paper data, it might get packaged up and sent away off-site to a third party who looks after that and does record storage. That's an asset that we need to be aware of and make sure it's protected. And then some organizations go even deeper than that, and they'll look at things such as the servers that they have, the server farms that they have, the infrastructure that they have holding, which protects information as well, because it allows a better data governance if they know which servers hold which information and so on. So it's a really broad area to be considering. And so broad, in fact, that I would say that there are two interested parties in it. One is going to be our data protection professional, and the other one is going to be your information governance or your data governance professional. They'll both have a very strong interest in information assets and how they're used.
And then again, Mark, maybe just expanding on that, what do you see as the benefits to an organisation of having such an asset register?
Well, I think we need to look at it in a few different ways. First of all, we have the data protection people, we have the data governance people, and we have the organisation. So your data protection and your data governance people are there to protect the organisation, the second line of defence when it comes to managing data across that organisation. So for data protection people, it's important to know where assets are and what assets are there, because we want to know that personal data on those assets is protected. So we're interested, as data protection people, we're interested from an access control perspective. We're interested because we want to know that data's held there securely, and we want to know that it's retained for as long as necessary as well. So they're the things that we're interested in. The data governance people in our organisation are interested for different reasons, or for quite often there's a lot of crossover, but they tend to then be interested because they want to know that assets are being backed up. They want to know that service level agreements with third parties who are holding those assets are in place and can be managed, those kind of things. So you kind of have the crossover there, and they're the real benefits to the individuals, and obviously the organisation benefits from those assets, because let's face it, they can't do their job, they can't meet their purpose if they can't manage those, if they can't get access to the data on those assets.
Thank you. And Simon, how have you found in your experience you can sell those benefits to the business?
Yeah, I think some of the key bits is to recognise that there's a value to the organisation, but equally to all the individuals that you serve, which might mean your customers as well as your employees too, and all the business partners that you work with. So if we look at from the organisational perspective, I think as Mark's kind of pointed to, really, there's kind of the legal perspective first of all, that we're putting strong kind of information governance practices or data protection practices in place to reduce the risk of any kind of enforcement actions, and to make sure that we've covered our bases from a GDPR point of view or other laws point of view, so that we're not incurring any enforcement actions or other regulatory action. Equally, class actions, of course, are possible, but equally on a broader level, it just makes good sense for organisations to understand what data they've got, where it's housed, how it's used, or it's a common sense sort of thing, I think, as well. But it helps kind of to foster the good relationships then with your customers, with other partners that you're working with that might provide essential services to enable you to operate, which is all built on trust and openness. So I think from that point of view, there's some real key benefits. And if we look at it very much from the customer perspective, as well as staff for that matter, it's about protecting individuals. And obviously that's what the foundation of data protection law is built on, is the protection of the individuals, both from the point of view of a data breach, protecting them from a data breach. If we know the assets that we've got and how they're protected, we stand a much better chance of being able to prevent data breaches, but equally any privacy violations that might come our way as well. So those, I think, are a number of benefits, really. And as well as Mark said about the collaboration, that data protection is not kind of the only team. It's not the only lens that we should look through it for. We've got kind of business continuity, we've got overall governance, and we've got, obviously, as you said, the security point of view as well. So there's a number of kind of teams there, as well as obviously the IT teams in general, and all of the business stakeholders that rely upon certain systems to do their jobs.
Yeah. And then, how do you make sure, Mark, that when you're doing all of this data mapping, for want of a better description, you generate something that has value and is not just a load of information gathering dust?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I think, and I think I pick up on the fact that you said data mapping, for want of a better description. I think quite often we can look at data mapping and think about how does data flow through the organisation and end up drawing nice, pretty pictures to see where data is flowing through an organisation. And I'm not a great fan of that personally. I think what we need to do as professionals is we need to understand how data is utilized from a data protection perspective. So I always latch on the term ROPA. ROPA is about processing activities. It's not about data flows. So for me, what we need to be doing as data protection professionals is understanding where data is being used, the activities around that. And once we start to understand that, what activities do we have? What type of assessments do we need to do on things like transparency and lawful basis and high risk assessments and data sharing assessments, etc., etc. Once we started to build a ROPA, that allows us to understand where data is being used. The information asset register it's almost inseparable to a ROPA in some degrees, because what the information asset register is telling us is where data is being used, where is it being stored, how is it being stored, and so it kind of gives us that next level of information. And then once we've got that, we should be able to identify where the risks are within the organization. So for me, if you want to do a nice pretty picture of where data flows, that's fantastic. There's no problem with that. You can certainly do that. But I don't think you can do that without having a ROPA in place first. And I don't think you can do that without having an understanding of where your data is held. All of those things come together to be able to create that overall view at the end of the day.
And anything that you want to add to that, Simon? And then I'm going to talk about ROPAs a bit more in a minute.
Great. Okay. Very much agree with what Mark said there. I guess I see it kind of as building blocks approach. So the kind of layers that I'd break it down a bit for people is one, so what are the systems and software that you're holding the data on, first of all, broadly the data, which would be, again, working with IT colleagues, looking at having a system register, a log of all of the systems that you've got, and which of those therefore are holding personal data. And then so what information assets, so what data broadly have I got on those systems? What is it used for? So like on the HR system, I've got, okay, what types of information am I holding on a HR system? What types of data have I got on my marketing system? That kind of thing. And then the third layer, as Mark said, from a data protection point of view, is the one where we're focusing our efforts really, is to understand, okay, so what are we using it for, and what protections, what measures and controls have we got around that, around things like data sharing, for example, around are we transparent about how we're using that data, are we able to respond when individuals send in a subject access request. So I kind of see it as a bit of a layered approach, but I totally agree with Mark. They've got to all be joined up. They've all got to be integrated. And that's where you really get success with this.
Okay, good. And it's probably the right time, Simon, to do the other poll that we've got on who's got ROPAs, who uses them.
Yeah, I thought there might be a good time. I'll pop it on screen now. Okay. So does your organisation have a record of processing activity?
Just getting some background noise again, folks. Thank you. And I can see everybody is kindly completing. Okay, so there we are. Yes, updated regularly, 47%, and yes, but it's a work in progress, which it's got to be, 39%, and then not yet, but we're thinking about it, 10, and no, 2%. And I suppose if we believe everything with the draft data protection and digital information bill, we're not going to have one at all. If that ever comes to fruition. In fact, I think the whole point of today is that whatever you call it, having some tool that identifies all of the assets you've got has got to be a good risk management tool and good for the business. And I'm going to ask Louise, how do you see the value of a ROPA?
For me, it's a massive value. It's such an important document. Obviously, as you've mentioned, it is currently a compliance requirement. Whether that stays or not, as an organisation, we will continue to use it for sure. It provides you with an overview of all of your processing activities, all in one place. and it enables you to identify gaps, which I think is really important for continuous improvement. You know, you can look to see whether your data is held in the UK or Europe or outside of that, and whether transfer risk assessment needs to be done. You can check to see if you've got adequate data protection impact assessments, legitimate interest assessments. Have we got them? Are they up to date? Have they been reviewed? You can also look to make sure that it links in with your privacy notices, as well as contracts with your legal team. Have we got the right contracts in place? Have we got the right standard contractual clauses? And all of that builds a really good risk profile. And you can start to build an action plan of what needs to be done, and you can prioritise that as well. So for me, it is a really valuable document, and it interlinks so much with other documentation, as I've mentioned, the DPIs and the LIAs and your privacy notices as well.
Yep, absolutely agree with you. And Mark, anything you'd like to add to what Louise has just said?
Yeah, it is. I think quite a few people talk about the ROPA as being something which is required through regulation. And at the moment it is. But actually, if you read what Article 30 says about a ROPA, it doesn't describe what we all actually do when it comes to creating what we call a ROPA. What a ROPA is, and why we need it, is because it's the ability for an organisation to understand what risks you've got. The ROPA within the regulation is much less than that. Well, sorry, within the regulation, it basically says, who are you? Who's your DPO? What things do you do? It doesn't actually ask you to go down into the level of risk that we all do as organisations. So the regulation changing and taking away the need for a ROPA it's irrelevant in my view. We all need to understand what risks we've got, and one of the best tools to do that is the tool that we all call the ROPA.
And Simon, anything you want to add to that?
No, I'm totally in agreement with Mark on that. Absolutely. I think, Louise, we've talked about that in the past as well. It's a great way of identifying the risks and knowing where do we need to do an assessment. Even if it's not something that you think is a high risk processing, it enables you to spot things that need digging into, be it, we might not have an up-to-date contract, for example, or, things that we've not fully covered in our privacy notice, things like that. So where there's some additional work done to improve your compliance. And I think the other bit that I would add is the fact that it enables you to demonstrate that compliance. So if one day the ICO comes knocking on your door and says, what did you do about a certain area of your processing, you've got documentary evidence that explains that not only shows them the mandatory areas of the ROPA, but will then link to other things that you've done, be it assessments, be it, I think, exactly as you've pointed out, really, Louise. So maybe I'm covering similar ground, but it is very much a central document that therefore is just really useful to an organisation, or at least should be used in ways that are really useful. Shouldn't just be something that we're ticking a box to comply. We should actually be getting some value out of it. And there's great opportunities around to gain that value as a data protection team if we use it well.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and it's not just a tick box. It's something that should, it's valuable. You constantly go back to that, and you should regularly review it, and regularly review it with your stakeholders as well. Your information asset owners, your data champions, because that brings them on board with that journey as well. And I just think it helps from a relationship point of view and an awareness point of view.
Yeah, and if I can just add some of my own experiences, I particularly found that when we get weaponized subject access requests or demands for right of erasure, often if the ROPA is really good, it should tell you what the ground was that you relied upon when you processed that particular category of data. And it could well be that you don't have to erase, or you shouldn't erase, because you weren't doing it for anything other than anti-money laundering or, anti-fraud purposes. And no, we won't delete the data. So again, I think having something that says what was the ground we relied upon for that category of data, and also linking the ROPA to retention policies as to how long you're keeping it and so on. It's as I think we've all said, it's absolutely core to managing the assets that you have and managing the risks that come with those assets. You referred to stakeholder, Louise, and I wanted to ask you, how have you found you can sell or get the different teams involved in utilising ROPRs and the combined information asset register?
Sorry, just unmuting there. Yeah, so we have regular meetings with our information asset owners and data champions, get them to take accountability for the ROPR and their own areas where they are accountable for that process and activity. Absolutely, 100%.
And Mark, anything you want to add to that?
I always say the same. Despite the fact that I run a software company, I always say exactly the same. Software toolsets are great, but what they don't do is they don't bring people together. The most important thing about implementing any software or any toolset is to make sure that you've got the organization design behind it, the operating model. So it's developing the risk log, great, fantastic. But if those risks have been added by yourselves as data governance people or data protection people, then you've got no buy-in from the rest of your business. And so how is the business going to learn how to manage its own risks if there's no buy-in in place? So those meetings which Louise talked about are key to understanding and building relationships with the stakeholders. So software or the Excel spreadsheets or whatever it is you're using can be used properly. And the ownership sits with the people who are using the data rather than with the people who are governing it.
Yeah, because if you take your stakeholders on that journey with you, it definitely helps that awareness piece. So when they're doing their day-to-day job, they can link it back to, all right, okay, this is on the ROPR, this is what I'm accountable for. It makes people much more aware, and it builds that relationship in that they come to you and they tell you things as well. If there's going to be a change to that process and activity, for example.
So while we've been talking, there's a question here that I'm gonna ask Simon to comment on first. There's confusion around what an information asset is and whether this relates to data, information, or records. How would you suggest we navigate this? When we talk about a ROPR, in my view, we're talking about a record of processing personal data. But if we're keeping an asset register, it could be information about intellectual property rights, contracts, corporate documents, tax returns. Mark, how do you explain to the business what goes where?
I think probably the simplest way to think about it is where data or information is stored. That's the way I tend to come from it. It might not necessarily cover the whole gambit, but it certainly gets you thinking the right way. So if data is stored on paper, that paper is an asset to your business. If data is stored on a system, that system is an asset towards your business. It's not the data necessarily; it's the asset that it's stored upon. What we're trying to protect and what we're trying to govern. So that for me is where we look at, and that's why when I first started talking about it, I was mentioning the fact that even something like a third-party provider like Iron Mountain, for example, would be something I would want to see on my information asset register. I would want to know that I have a relationship with Iron Mountain, so that at some point I can look at the service level agreements that Iron Mountain offer me, or I can look at how is data accessed when Iron Mountain is holding that data, how long do we keep that data for with Iron Mountain, and so on. So it's really trying to understand where your data is going, where it's stored, and that's the thing then you're looking at. You're looking at the intricacies of that and how do you protect that data there.
So you're describing there obviously a very living and breathing 365 type process. Louise touched on this, but I'm going to ask Simon just some thoughts. How do you ensure that the living, breathing register or registers are living and breathing? How do you get people to contribute on a timely fashion?
Yeah, that's a really good point, and I think, as we touched on, it's very much an organisational and an engagement type thing. It's being able to show people how they benefit from having that, and particularly, I think the information asset owners are key here. You know, the key leaders in each area, let's call them stakeholders, whichever you want, but the key leaders of each business function. It's one, they get full visibility of what their teams are doing with the data, which actually, from my experience, they don't always know. They might think they do, but when you actually go through the process of talking to individuals across the business and gathering the information that you need on, okay, you've got this information, you've got this data, let's say personal data, what are you actually using it for? It's more than they realise generally, and certainly from the point of view of, therefore, the information asset owner, as we're calling it, the individual therefore is responsible for that data. And I'll look at just personal data here, to be able to kind of to be able to protect that and manage the compliance of all the obligations that you have with that. They don't always have the visibility, so I think that's the first thing that they get out of it. But to be able to, what we're really looking for is for people to flag up when something new happens, when they're bringing on a new supplier, when they're changing their process, and I think it's to be able to kind of just work together very much in doing that, and be able to show them how you're helping to protect the individuals that are affected by that processing, which often, let's take a marketing team, for example, is their customers. They're interested in protecting their brand relationships. They're interested in being able to demonstrate to customers that are looking after their data properly. Equally, just the same if you're in a team that's managing supplier data, for example, or working with partners. It's being able to kind of walk the walk and be able to demonstrate that you're protecting that data properly, in line with what the law requires. And I think we're all stakeholders in that, really, at the end of the day.
And Louise, how are you getting the team to cooperate?
We have a Data Champions forum on our internal workplace page, which we regularly update as a data protection team with any key topics we think would be interesting, I think would be relevant to our business, to help that continuous awareness piece and that engagement piece. And they just go on an ad hoc basis, but it's also a forum where those data champions can get together and talk. We also have regular data champion forums, whether that be in person centrally or across our parks on Teams calls, just to keep those relationships going, and for data champions to share best practices, what's went wrong, what's went well, for example. And I mentioned before the ROPA meetings. We have regularly quarterly ROPA meetings across all our key functions that process personal data, and that is led by myself and my team member. And our information asset owners come to those, as do data champions. So they've got a real awareness piece of what's going on in their area. And as Simon mentioned before, it's a trigger for some people to remember, oh, we've made a change to that process and activity, we've made a change to that supplier, but they maybe forgot to tell us. But because we're doing them on such a regular basis, then that mitigates that risk. I think that's really important. It's just to keep those conversations going all of the time. So it's that continuation.
And as you're doing your regular meetings and training and so on, do you think you can possibly do this without management software? I mean, is this something that a small organisation could do manually?
Absolutely, and to be honest, that's actually what we do. We looked at some options to bring on board systems to automate a lot of our processes, like our business as usual, DSARs, DPIs, that kind of thing, ROPA. And to be honest, at the time, it was just too expensive. So we've just continued with manual processes. So, good old-fashioned Excel. And it works for us, to be honest. I think you do have to have really robust standard operating procedures as a data protection function team to make that work. They've got to be continuously updated and reviewed all of the time. It's got to be completely accurate. But if you manage the team well and you've got those standard operating procedures, it can work. And it has worked for us, and we are going to continue with that for now because it works.
Thank you. And in one of my roles as an external data protection officer, my global client has a fabulous set of technology, which I can't understand. It is so complex. I wish we were manual. We're in an organization where English is not the mother tongue, and so sometimes the instructions do not make sense to me as a non-German speaker. Mark, how do you find you can adapt something like you offer for both the small and the large organization?
That's a really good question. I think it is possible to build multiple versions of the same thing. It's not something that we focus on, to be perfectly honest. We're specialising in the UK market at the moment, so that's clearly something we want to do because the other aspect of that as well, Robert, is the way the regulation changes across different jurisdictions as well. So yes, there are tools out there which are purely international, do lots of things across lots of different jurisdictions. So it can be done, without a doubt it can be done. But it's the same principle, I think, as what we've talked about earlier. The word proportionality comes into the regulation quite a lot across GDPR, and I think we need to, as a group of professionals, I think we need to recognise that word. Louise, for example, is using Microsoft Excel because proportionally that works for her organisation. It's a cheaper way of doing things. It's relatively cost-free. Obviously, it's manual work, but it's there and it's relatively cost-free, and it can be managed that way. Take a step up from that and go to some kind of relational database. You can build into that much more around helping people to fill in the ROPA, for example. You can make the software work better in respect it'll only ask questions when it needs to ask questions and so on. So you can really start to refine the way that software works with your teams. But you also get other benefits out of a relational database as well. So, for example, I would imagine that lots of people using Excel will have an Excel ROPA, and they might have an Excel information asset register, and they might have another Excel which is their international data transfers, and then another one maybe which has got data sharing on there, and so on. All of those in separate Excel spreadsheets makes it very difficult to understand which activity is using which asset, or which activity is using which data sharing piece. And that's where a relational database starts to work for an organization. So you have to be a certain size, or you have to have a certain level of complexity. But when you reach that level of complexity, you actually do need to take a step up from Excel at that point. So software can really help, but you just need to remember it's got to be proportionate.
And so you were just mentioning there, Mark, the sort of different registers that one might have. We've got a question that has come in. What are your views on combined ROPAs and information asset registers? Simon, what do you think?
Yeah, I think personally, I think it's generally a good thing, because I think the ROPA can overlay the asset register. The question really is we've been talking about the word information and data here. So the question really is the information asset register going, and I think it's one of the big challenges for organizations. Are you going to try and log all of your information assets across the business, which includes all the corporate records and all the other things, IP and all that stuff that we've been talking about? Or are you going to focus your effort primarily on personal data? And I certainly think in terms of being able to govern your personal data, there's a great benefit in here, in being able to understand what personal data assets are you holding, get that logged into the information asset register, and then to be able to kind of link that up so that the record of processing already has an understanding of what is that data, where does it reside, is it with a third party or is it in-house, all of those kind of things. So you've already got a foundation then for building the roper on top. It would be lovely, I think, in organisations to also have that same additional information for your other information assets, as we said, corporate data, all of those things. But that's really, I think, there are other teams, I guess, that will comment on that, because there's obviously going to be additional complexity, additional time, resources that's involved in building a broader information asset register than just what we would need for data protection purposes. So I think that's probably for others to answer the benefits of that. But from my point of view, looking at it from a data protection point of view, absolutely agree that there's a benefit in integrating them for just the reasons that Mark said, and Louise touched on as well.
Yeah, do you want to add anything, Louise, to that?
No.
Okay. So, Mark, anything you want to add?
Yeah. So for me, it comes back to what I mentioned earlier. You having them not combined just means more work in trying to understand where data's going. So by combining something makes life easier, but you can't really do it with Excel. I think you need to. It's at the point when you're wanting to try to really understand where data flows, how it moves across organisations, how it moves across different assets, and so on, and which activities are touching on those assets, and which activities are using the same data sharing relationships. That's when you need to step up to some kind of software solution.
So we've got a bit of noise in the background again. I'm not sure where it's coming from, but if we can mute when we're not talking, it's probably best. Thank you.
So I mean, from my perspective, I find it difficult to just look at the personal data as the asset, because and you may have heard me on other webinars say this, often when there's a data incident, the privacy folks leap up and down, but in fact, your biggest concern is confidentiality or trade secrets or breach of contracts. And I do think it's important that you understand what you've got, whether it's an asset, software, a thing, and where is it? And it could be that it's not with you, it's with a third party. And in relation to that, we've had one or two comments or questions about how do you identify the role of that third party? Is that third party merely a cloud provider, or is that third party a processor or a sub-processor? How have you found in practice, Simon, you address that type of question?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Robert, because you're quite right that different kinds of breaches may involve data that's not personal, and therefore could still impact the business and could still impact other businesses that you work with, for that matter, and still have legal risks, of course, for the organisation. So I certainly think that's a good thing to have visibility of, and governance, of course, over. And you can only do that if you've got all of the information recorded on the asset register. Sorry, was there a particular point that you wanted me to answer with that, Robert? But I agree with what you're saying. I think that's absolutely.
Well, I suppose the one thing I did want you to talk about is the particular question that came in. Let me just see if I can find it. How do you determine whether a third party is a sub-processor and when they are a supplier, particularly where the third party provides integration services to a cloud service provider? It may be, look at the contract.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it, really. And I guess it depends what your own status is, whether you're a controller or whether you're a processor, in fact, therefore subcontracting to a sub-processor who will have a sub-processor beneath them, for that matter. But yes, it depends in which party you're contracted with. So let's take the view that you're the controller. You should have an agreement in place, data protection, a data processing agreement as well with a processor, and also be aware of kind of the sub-processes that they are using, because they're obliged to notify you about that. And they should have a contract in place with their sub-processors. So it's just working through it to understand who's contracted to who down the chain. But I think this is particularly an issue that organisations are having to deal with, because obviously those supply chains are quite big. At the end of the day, many organisations would have multiple sub-processors who equally have sub-processors that are working for them. They're not short chains anymore. So it's something we do need to unpick.
Okay, thank you. One of the other questions we had in advance was, can you share any examples of the types of measures and controls you can put in place to mitigate risks? Mark?
Yeah, well, if you want to understand the kind of measures and controls that you can put in place, there's probably no better place to look than ISO 27001. The 2023 version's got 93 controls in there, and it's probably one of the more robust standards out there. So what I'm not advocating necessarily is that especially for smaller organizations, is that you try to become ISO 27001 compliant. But it's information available to you. Just Google it. 93 controls covering organizational controls, technical controls, controls around your people, and controls around physical controls as well. So if you're looking for ideas, that's a great place to start. Absolutely, without a doubt. What I would do, first thing I would do with my clients is look at policy. Policy is the start of all of these controls, and it's also the thing which gains your stakeholders engagement. If you write a policy and you get your board or your executive to agree to that policy, then they're committing to what you've written in your policy. So it's the first control you should be putting in place. It steers everything else. And I would generally go for two policies. I would go for a data protection policy, and I would, as a data protection person, insist that there's some kind of information security or information governance policy as well. Mm-hmm. And that covers off both aspects, which we're covering a number of times, which is, are we just talking about personal data or non-personal data? So your data protection policy is there to ensure that you've got the right level of rules within your organizations to look after data subjects, and your data governance or information security policy is there to make sure that you're protecting the data. And that kind of really is your starting point to work from. But yeah, if you're really after some good steer, have a look at ISO 27001. There's plenty to go at.
Simon, anything to add to what Mark said?
I think that's a good point. Being 93 of them, though, it's obviously, as Mark said, a big list. So let's try and pick out some of the key things. So I'd, again, try and pick up on that word proportionate again, and look at and say that the measures and controls that you put in place would be relevant to the type of risk, the nature of the risk. So take into account the sensitivity of the data, the volume as well, as Mark said, the policies that you have protecting that, but also consider the organisation's risk appetite as well. Whether your organisation is a particularly cautious organisation, or whether they have a wider kind of risk appetite from that point of view. But then in terms of the kind of security controls, there's obviously multiple types of security controls, first of all. So we'd highlight, normally when we're talking to clients, we highlight things like multi-factor authentication, restricted access, making sure that the data is, particularly personal data, is restricted to specific individuals to be able to perform specific tasks, those kind of things. Looking particularly at file sharing, which is somewhere where we often find that there are risks and issues around how people go about sharing data, either within the organisation or with third parties. So that's just a little thing to touch on security. But if we look from a privacy point of view, we're looking to recognise the various obligations that we have, and looking to meet all of the principles that we have in data protection law. So from that point of view, I'm looking at things like, have we provided the appropriate training to our staff? Have we got the right policies and procedures, and are people following them, as Mark says? The other key one is privacy information. Have we been transparent enough about the processing that we're doing? And to be honest, where a number of assessments that I do working with clients, Privacy information is a very common theme that comes up. Have we told people about it? Have we been clear enough about our processing? So reviewing the privacy information that you provide in your privacy notice is a very common control, I would say, one that you need to keep up to speed with. Records management, we've talked about. We've talked about that a lot already, so I won't touch on that anymore. Your supplier management contracts, have we got a data processing agreement in place? And the other one that Mark mentioned earlier on, of course, is data retention as well. How long are we keeping this data for? And making sure that you've got a period, because it's all too tempting to say, okay, we'll keep that data and nobody ever deletes it. It ends up sitting there for year on year. So one of the most important controls to put in place is to make sure that not only have we decided how long we're keeping it, but we've got a process for for going back and reviewing how long have we held it, right, and making sure that that data is either destroyed or anonymized at the appropriate time. So those are just some of the more common kind of controls and measures that I think I'd be mindful of.
And I, putting my solicitor hat on, sort of jaundiced approach is not what should we be doing, but what do we wish we had done when it all goes wrong, and so, I mean, I'm only saying the same as Mark and Simon, looking at this proactively. Here's the things that we should have. But yeah, I do think you almost do need somebody to be saying, what's the worst that's going to happen? And you are bound to get the ICO asking for the ROPA, for the do you do training, how could this have happened, etc., etc. And I'm sure you've all seen this, but believe me, in the last week I have seen 2 law firms whose privacy notices still refer to the 1998 Act, are just so hideously out of date. You think, this simply does not look good. Mm. So we have one more question.
Sorry, Robert. The other one with that is Privacy Shield. The number of privacy
yes.
notices that mention the Privacy Shield too, or all of those kind of things, or even Safe Harbor. I've seen some with Safe Harbor still on from years ago.
Yeah.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So we've got a question. I start with Louise with this one. What should a new privacy manager focus on in their first 100 days?
I would say absolutely the existing data protection framework. What has the organisation already got in place? And almost do an audit of it. What policies and procedures are in place? When were they last updated? Are they in a place, that staff can easily access them? Are they aware of them? Are your privacy notices up to date? What kind of annual training do you offer your team members? Is it relevant to the role in the organisation? Does that need to be updated? What is the culture and the awareness like in the organisation? Do people have an understanding of what data protection is and their responsibilities? Data and document retention policy has been mentioned a few times on this call. That's really important. There's no point in having a retention schedule that nobody adheres to. People need to be aware of it and actually delete the data when they say they're going to delete the data. Your marketing team compliance as well. Are they really up to speed with all of the things they need to do? What more can you do to support them in your new role? ROPA, obviously we've talked about a lot in this call as well. Do you have a ROPA? When was it last updated? Is it fit for purpose? And then all of your BAU stuff as well. How well do you manage those data subject access requests? How well do you manage your data breaches? What is the awareness like in the organisation of DPIAs? Look at the frequency year on year of what's coming your way. You should really be seeing an increase in that if the awareness is there. And again, that all links back to the ROPA too. I'd say, your framework, absolutely. Do an audit.
And actually, just before I leave you, Louise, there's a question come in. Can you answer this one? Should details of the EU representatives be included in your ROPA?
We are just a UK-based company, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that. But I would say if we were, then yes. But maybe Simon's better placed to answer that question.
Okay, I'll answer it. The answer is yes. Sorry. Mark, what would you do if you were in your first 100 days as the new privacy manager?
I'm going to spin it a little bit, Robert, if you don't mind. Because what we do when we're implementing ProvePrivacy is we look at 3 key points. And I think these 3 key points work for anybody who comes into data protection and tries to understand how they're going to manage their business. So the first point that we look at is engagement and training. There's no point in bringing any software application into any business if the people who are going to use that software don't understand it, don't understand the regulation which they're trying to capture as part of it. So any privacy manager coming in needs to understand and needs to make sure that there's engagement at the top of the organization and engagement with at least the data champions within the organization, and that those data champions understand the risks that they're looking for. So they don't have to be data protection experts, but they do need to have that awareness of what they're looking for. The second thing that they would do within those 100 days is identify the risks. And the tools which we talked about throughout this call today are the way that we identify those risks. So we build a roper. We talk to the data champions. They're the people who understand what activities they do. Once you've given them that training to be able to identify the risks, they're able to look at those activities and start to document and assess those activities for some kind of risk. But we don't forget they're not the experts, but they can at least assess it. And then the third part of that, the third layer, is building the operating model to make sure that those risks which have been identified can be addressed. So we've already said that your data champions don't necessarily understand the law very well, but we do as data protection people. So how do we get that problem from the data champion up to the data protection person? The only way to do that is through some kind of governance. And Louise has mentioned it herself. She has data champion meetings. There are workshops, there are forums, there are regular meetings where the people who know what they do meet with the people who know how to handle the risk. And that's what we try to do within the first 100 days when we put the software in place, is trying to get the organizations to build around the software how they manage their business. Because if they don't do that, any software application, be it Excel or ProvePrivacy, will fail in its implementation if you've not got the organization behind it. So that's what we focus on.
Thank you. And I'm going to get you, Simon, to answer the same question. First 100 days as a privacy manager, and then I'm conscious we have about 2 minutes to go. So when you finish, Simon, I'll let you close.
Well, I'll be very quick then in that case, Robert, because I think Louise gave a kind of ideal model answer. She covered all the things that I had on my little tick list, and Mark's talked about it from a technology point of view as well, and the importance in terms of the understanding of the technology and working, making sure that people understand how it's used. So I think that answer, I don't want to add too much, to be quite honest, in that area. So I think that covers it very much. The only other one thing I'd just mention is the importance of getting to know your executive team, particularly in terms of the buy-in. You know, what level of buy-in, which I think you did mention briefly, Louise, is just making sure that you've got the buy-in there, and you've got a friendly ear that you can talk to from that point of view, because having buy-in is going to be essential around the board table, or around the exec team. That's the key thing, I think, in the first 100 days. It's a lot of it's going to be the people stuff. So I appreciate we've only got a minute or so left. I just want to give others the opportunity as well. Mark, Louise, do you want to just say a final closing thought, or do you have anything else that you wanted to just finish off on?
No, just thank you for having us.
It's been great. Mark?
And I would echo that as well. Thanks very much for joining, and it's been a pleasure.
Brilliant. Well, thank you both. That's been great. I found it very, very interesting and entertaining. Thank you, Robert, for being a very, very able host as ever, and keeping us going, keeping us on track. And we've covered a lot of ground today. So I hope everyone's found it interesting. I hope you found it useful. I think there's been some great comments as well, I see come up in the chat. But we're up to the hour, so we'll leave it there. Thanks very much, everyone, and hope to see you again soon. Take care.
Bye.